Legendary voices don't usually tremble, but Michael Douglas's did that night, soft and cracked, as if every word he spoke was peeling open an old wound that Hollywood had spent decades trying to bury. He sat alone in a dim studio, the kind of place where secrets echo louder than applause, and he whispered that after 81 years of silence, he was finally ready to tell the truth about Rob Reiner, a truth that had been eating at his soul like a slow, unforgiving illness. For most of the world, Michael Douglas has always been the face of strength, a man who survived the impossible, who fought cancer and public scandals, and still walked red carpets with a smile that seemed unbreakable. But behind that smile was a story so heavy he said it felt like carrying a coffin on his back for half a century. He spoke of the first time he met Rob Reiner in a smoky Hollywood backroom, when both of them were younger and full of dangerous ambition, and how there was an instant understanding between them, a silent pact that they would protect each other no matter what. At the time, it felt like brotherhood. Now, Michael called it a curse. His voice dropped when he talked about his father, Kirk Douglas, and the pressure of living up to a legendary name. Kirk had warned him once, late at night, when the house was quiet and the lights were low, that Hollywood was not just a place of dreams, but a place of deals made in shadows. Michael admitted he hadn't listened. He was too hungry, too eager to belong. And Rob Reiner, charming and brilliant, had been standing right there offering him a seat at a table most men never even knew existed. There were parties Michael said he wished he could erase from his memory, gatherings at lavish homes where famous faces like Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty laughed loudly, while secrets were passed as casually as champagne glasses. Rob was always in, the center, smiling, listening, remembering everything. Michael described feeling like he was being slowly pulled into something he couldn't escape, a web of favors and silent promises that tied his career to Rob's in ways that felt unbreakable. Every success came with a shadow. Every award came with a reminder of what he owed. Then Michael's voice broke as he spoke about illness, not just his own, but the sickness he felt in his conscience. When he was diagnosed with cancer, lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms and fear in his chest, he said he started to hear the ghosts of the past more clearly than ever. He remembered a night when Rob Reiner had called him, late and frantic, asking for help with something that could destroy them both if it ever came out. Michael never said exactly what it was, only that it involved someone young, someone vulnerable, and a secret that had the power to ruin families and careers alike. His wife, Catherine Zeta-Jones, had noticed the change in him long before he spoke it out loud. He would wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, whispering Rob's name like a prayer or a curse. Their children, he said, felt the distance too, the way their father seemed haunted even when he was sitting right there at the dinner table. He hated himself for letting those secrets poison his family, but he was too afraid to speak. Rob knew too much. Rob always knew too much. Michael admitted that there were moments when he wanted to walk away, to confess everything and let the world judge him. But every time he got close, Rob would remind him of all the lies that would be shattered. Not just theirs, but the innocent ones, too. He spoke of an unspoken understanding between them, a dark loyalty that felt stronger than fear. It was a bond forged not in friendship, but in shared guilt, and it was slowly killing him from the inside. As he told the story, tears slid down Michael Douglas's face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He said he had spent decades playing powerful men on screen, but in real life, he had never felt more powerless. He thought about people like Meryl Streep and Steven Spielberg, who had crossed paths with both him and Rob, never knowing what was hidden behind the smiles and handshakes. He wondered how many of them would look at him differently if they ever knew the truth. The night Rob Reiner almost died, Michael said everything changed. He got a call that Rob was in the hospital, barely conscious, and that his last words had been Michael's name. Sitting at Rob's bedside, watching the machines keep him alive, Michael felt something inside him crack. Rob had squeezed his hand weakly and whispered that some secrets were never meant to be buried forever. Michael said he didn't know if that was a warning or a confession, but it stayed with him like a scar. Now, at 81, after surviving cancer and outliving so many of his peers, Michael said he was tired of carrying what he called a moral tumor in his chest. He didn't want to leave this world the way his father had warned him about, full of unspoken regrets and hidden sins. He wanted his children to know who he really was, not just a man on the movie posters. And he wanted Rob Reiner, whether alive or gone, to finally face the truth they had both run from for so long. The studio was silent as Michael Douglas took a deep breath, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump into a story that could destroy everything he had ever built. His eyes were red, his hands shaking, but there was a strange calm in his voice, the calm of a man who had already lost too much to be afraid anymore. He leaned forward, closer to the camera, as if he were speaking directly to every viewer's soul, and he began to reveal just how deep Rob Reiner's shadow really went. Michael's voice grew quieter, almost fragile, as he went deeper, as if the memories themselves were standing right in front of him, daring him to keep going. He said the first real fracture in his soul came years ago, long before the world knew him as a survivor, when he realized that the truth about Rob Reiner wasn't just about one man's mistakes, but about an entire system that fed on silence. He described being invited to a private screening in the early days of his career, a film no one was supposed to see, attended only by a handful of powerful people. Rob had insisted he come. Michael remembered sitting in the dark, feeling something was wrong, and noticing how Rob watched the room more than the screen, measuring who looked away and who stayed. After that night, Michael said, things between them changed. Rob began to call him more often, not as a friend, but as someone checking on an investment. Favors were asked, doors were opened, but there was always an invisible string attached, tightening every time Michael tried to pull away. He spoke of moments when he felt like screaming, when he wanted to call his father and tell him everything, but fear kept his mouth shut. Kirk Douglas had been a giant of Hollywood, but even giants could be crushed by the weight of scandal. Michael couldn't bear the thought of being the one to bring his family down. There was a particular incident Michael described with shaking hands, one that involved a young actress who came to him in tears after a meeting with Rob. He said she'd begged him to help her, to make it stop, and he had promised her he would. But when he confronted Rob, the response was cold and terrifying. Rob reminded him of all the secrets they shared, all the people who would be hurt if one thread was pulled. Michael said that was the moment he realized he was trapped. The young actress disappeared from Hollywood not long after, and the guilt of that has followed him like a ghost ever since. That he talked about how illness has a way of stripping away lies. When cancer ravaged his body, when doctors spoke in hushed tones and his children cried at his bedside, Michael began to see his life in a different light. Fame and awards felt meaningless compared to the weight of what he had hidden. Catherine would hold his hand and tell him to fight, but he felt like he was fighting more than just disease. He was fighting the truth he had buried, the truth about Rob Reiner and the damage that had been done. Michael said there were nights when he dreamed of that young actress, of her face asking him why he hadn't been brave. He dreamed of Rob too, always smiling, always untouchable, as if Hollywood itself were protecting him. He woke up from those dreams choking on regret, wishing he could go back and choose differently. He wondered how many others like her had been swallowed by the machine, their stories erased so that powerful men could stay powerful. He also spoke of other famous figures who had brushed up against the same darkness, names that made his stomach turn. He mentioned how even someone like Robin Williams, whose laughter lit up the world, had once confided in him about how cruel and twisted the industry could be behind closed doors. Those conversations had haunted Michael, because they all pointed to the same ugly truth that too many people knew and too few were willing to speak. As Rob Reiner grew older, Michael said, the fear didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. There were moments when Rob would call him, sounding paranoid, asking if anyone had been asking questions, if any old stories were coming back to life. Michael realized then that Rob was just as trapped as he was, a prisoner of the secrets they shared. But that didn't make the pain easier to live with. It only made it heavier. One evening, after a particularly dark call from Rob, Mika, El said he sat alone in his living room and broke down completely. His children were upstairs. Catherine was asleep. And there he was, a man the world thought was strong, crying like a child because he didn't know how to escape the past. He whispered that he hated himself for not being brave when it mattered most, for letting fear decide who he became. The camera in the studio caught every tear as Michael admitted that part of him still loved Rob, or at least the man he thought Rob was when they were young and hopeful. That made everything more painful. Betrayal from a stranger hurts, but betrayal from someone you once trusted can tear your heart apart. He didn't know if Rob ever truly felt remorse, but he knew that whatever was between them had poisoned both their lives. As Michael paused, taking a shaky breath, it felt as if he were standing on the edge of something enormous, a truth so heavy it could crush him if he let it fall. He said there was one night, one phone call, that finally convinced him he could no longer stay silent, no matter the cost. And as he began to describe that night, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination that made it impossible to look away. Michael leaned back slightly, as if the memory itself had weight, pressing against his chest. He said that night came quietly, not with sirens or headlines, but with a simple phone call that rang through his house long after everyone else had gone to bed. It was Rob on the other end, his voice thin and unsteady, nothing like the confident director the world knew. Rob told him he was scared. He said people were starting to ask questions, that old stories were bubbling up like something rotten beneath the surface, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold everything together. Michael listened in silence, feeling something inside him finally snap. Rob had whispered something that still made Michael's hands tremble just thinking about it. He said there were things he had done that could never be undone, lives that had been altered forever, and that if the truth came out, it would destroy more than just him. He begged Michael to stay loyal, to remember the pact they made when they were young. That word, loyalty, felt like a knife in Michael's heart. He realized then that Rob wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for protection. After that call, Michael said he went into his children's rooms and watched them sleep, their faces peaceful and innocent, completely unaware of the darkness their father had been carrying. He felt a wave of shame so strong it almost knocked him to his knees. He thought about how many parents out there had lost their children's trust because of secrets like these. He swore to himself in that moment that he would not leave this world without at least trying to make things right. But trying came with consequences. Michael said that not long after, he started getting strange messages, warnings disguised as friendly check-ins from people he hadn't heard from in years. Producers, agents, old acquaintances who suddenly seemed very interested in how he was doing. It was as if an invisible alarm had been triggered. Rob's fear was spreading, and with it, the pressure to stay quiet. He spoke about how Catherine noticed the tension immediately. She asked him if someone was threatening him, if something bad was happening. He wanted to tell her everything, to let her share the burden, but he was afraid of pulling her into the storm. Instead, he carried it alone, and that loneliness hurt almost as much as the guilt. He said there were moments he thought the stress might kill him before the cancer ever did. Michael also revealed that he had tried to quietly help one of Rob's past victims, one who had reached out years later, still broken, still searching for closure. He said he sent money, connected them with lawyers, did what he could without exposing himself. But even that small act of kindness filled him with fear. Every good deed felt like it could be the one that brought everything crashing down that he talked about running into Rob at an awards ceremony not long after that late-night call. Cameras were flashing. Smiles were being forced. To the world, they looked like two old friends sharing a joke. But when Rob leaned in close, he whispered, almost pleading, that Michael had to remember what was at stake. Michael said that was when he truly saw how trapped Rob was by his own past, how terror had replaced the charm that once defined him. The weight of it all began to affect Michael's health. He said doctors warned him that stress was making his recovery harder, that he needed peace if he wanted to live. But how could he have peace when every day he woke up knowing he was protecting something so ugly? He felt like his body was fighting two battles at once, one against disease and one against the truth. There were times when he almost called a journalist, almost picked up the phone and let everything spill out. But then he would think about the families who would be torn apart, the people who would be dragged into a scandal they never asked for. He was torn between justice and destruction, Between telling the truth and causing unimaginable pain, as he spoke, Michael's eyes grew distant, as if he were watching his own life play out in front of him. He said the hardest part was knowing that no matter what he chose, someone was going to get hurt. That was the real tragedy of Rob Reiner's shadow, that it didn't just fall on one man, but on everyone who had ever been close to him. The room felt heavier as Michael took another deep breath, preparing to go even further into the story, to a place he had never taken anyone before. His voice steadied, but there was an unmistakable ache behind it, the sound of a man about to reveal something that had been tearing him apart for decades. Michael said there was a moment, not long ago, when he realized time was running out, not just for Rob, but for himself too. Age has a way of pulling secrets to the surface, he said, like cracks forming in old walls. He began to feel that if he didn't speak now, the truth would die with him, and that thought terrified him more than any headline ever could. He remembered his father's last days, how Kirk Douglas had looked at him with tired eyes and told him that the greatest regret of his life was not what he had done, but what he had never admitted. Those words came back to Michael again and again, like a warning from beyond the grave. He described a private meeting he had with Rob not long after that realization. They met in a quiet restaurant, tucked away from paparazzi, where the waiters pretended not to recognize them. Rob looked older, smaller, almost fragile, nothing like the powerful man he once was. Michael said he could see fear in Rob's eyes, the kind of fear that comes from knowing the past is catching up to you. They spoke in low voices, circling around the truth without naming it, until finally Michael told Rob he couldn't keep doing this anymore. Rob's reaction, Michael said, was heartbreaking and horrifying at the same time. He begged. He apologized. He even cried. But beneath all of it was still that same desperate need to be protected. He said he had given everything to his career, that he didn't know how to live if it all fell apart. Michael felt a wave of pity, but also a surge of anger. So many other lives have been broken in the name of that care. Why did Rob's comfort matter more than their pain? After that meeting, Michael said, he felt a strange kind of peace for the first time in years. It was the peace of someone who had finally chosen a side, even if he didn't yet know what the outcome would be. He started writing things down, memories, names, dates, details he had spent decades trying to forget. It was painful, like reopening old wounds, but it also felt necessary, like cleaning out an infection so it could finally heal. He talked about reaching out to an old friend, a respected journalist who had once exposed corruption in Hollywood. Sitting across from that person, Michael said he felt like he was about to step off a cliff. He didn't give everything away, not yet, but he said enough to make it clear that something big was coming. The look in that journalist's eyes told him he was playing with fire. But for the first time, Michael wasn't afraid to get burned. The strain on his family became impossible to ignore. Catherine could tell he was holding something back, something enormous. One night, he finally broke down and told her pieces of the truth. He said he had never seen so much pain and strength in one face at the same time. She cried. She got angry. She held him. And then she told him that whatever happened, she would stand by him if he chose to do the right thing. That moment, Michael said, felt like being given a second chance at life. That he also thought about the victims, the people whose names never made it into magazines, whose stories were never turned into movies. He wondered if they would ever believe that someone like him could truly be sorry. He hoped that by speaking out, he could at least give them a small piece of the justice they had been denied. Michael admitted that part of him still feared what Rob might do if everything came out. Not violence, but the kind of damage that powerful people can inflict with a few phone calls and a lot of influence. Careers could be ended, reputations destroyed, but he was tired of living in fear. At 81, he said, fear had taken Nug. As the studio lights glowed softly around him, Michael's face looked both older and lighter, as if sharing the story was slowly lifting a weight he had carried for a lifetime. He said there was one final conversation with Rob, one that changed everything and made it impossible for him to stay silent any longer. His voice grew quiet again, heavy with memory, as he began to describe the last time they ever spoke. Michael closed his eyes for a moment before continuing, as if he were bracing himself against a wave of pain. He said that final conversation with Rob happened on a rainy afternoon, the kind that makes the whole world feel smaller and more fragile. Rob had called him unexpectedly, his voice weak and strained, and for the first time Michael could hear something he had never heard before in him: genuine regret. Not the kind that asks to be forgiven, but the kind that knows forgiveness may never come. Rob told him he was sick, not just physically, but in a way that went deeper, in a way that had been rotting inside him for years. He said he couldn't sleep anymore, that the faces of people he had hurt kept appearing in his dreams. He admitted that he had used his power to silence others, that he had convinced himself it was all just part of the business, until one day he realized he was lying to himself. Michael listened, torn between sympathy and rage, between the memory of their shared youth and the weight of everything Rob was finally confessing. There was a long pause on the line, and then Rob said something that Michael will never forget. He said that if the truth ever came out, Michael should tell it his way, not the way Hollywood would twist it. He said Michael was the only one who knew everything, the only one who could explain how it all really happened. To hear Rob place that burden on him, even in what might have been his most honest moment, felt cruel, and heartbreaking all at once. After that call ended, Michael said he sat in silence for hours, staring at the wall, feeling as if a chapter of his life had closed. He didn't know if Rob would ever speak publicly, or if he even had the strength to. But he knew something fundamental had changed. The secret was no longer just a chain binding them together. It had become a responsibility, one that now rested almost entirely on Michael's shoulders. He began to imagine what it would be like if the world finally knew, if the carefully polished image of Rob Reiner cracked and revealed the damage beneath. He knew people would accuse him too, would ask why he hadn't spoken sooner, why he had waited so long. He had no good answer, only the truth that fear and loyalty and ambition had tangled together in ways he hadn't understood until it was too late. Michael talked about writing letters he never sent to people who had been hurt, apologizing for his silence. He kept them in a drawer by his bed, a private confession that no one else had ever seen. Some nights he would take them out and read them, imagining what it would feel like to finally hand them over, to say I am sorry without hiding behind fame or excuses. His health, he said, had become a constant reminder that life is not endless. Every ache, every doctor's visit, every quiet moment made him more determined not to leave this world with his story untold. He didn't want his children to inherit his shame. He wanted them to inherit his courage, even if that courage came far too late. As he spoke, Michael's voice grew steadier, as if each word was helping him reclaim a piece of himself. He said that the truth about Rob Reiner was not just about exposing one man's mistakes. It was about breaking a cycle of silence that had allowed too many people to suffer in the dark. He knew the fallout would be massive, that power few. Figures would scramble to protect themselves, that Hollywood would pretend to be shocked even though many had always known. The studio felt thick with emotion as Michael reached the edge of what he was ready to reveal. He said that everything he had shared so far was only the beginning, that the deepest, most painful parts of the story were still ahead. His eyes glistened as he took another breath, preparing to go where he had never gone before, into the heart of what Rob Reiner had truly done and what it had cost so many people. Michael leaned forward again, as if he were speaking to someone sitting just inches away from him, someone who needed to hear every word. He said the deepest truth about Rob Reiner was not a single event, but a pattern, a long trail of quiet destruction that had been hidden behind success and charm. There were people, he said, whose lives had veered off course after crossing Rob's path, dreams that had withered, families that had fractured, and no one ever connected the dots because the industry was too busy celebrating the man behind the movies. He spoke of one family in particular, a mother who had written to him years ago, her letters soaked with pain. Her daughter, once full of ambition, had left Hollywood broken and silent after a series of meetings with powerful men, Rob among them. Michael had read that letter over and over, each time feeling like his chest was being crushed. He never replied, not because he didn't care, but because he was terrified of what answering it would unleash. That guilt, he said, was something he would carry forever. Michael also admitted that there were moments when he had benefited from the very system he now condemned. Roles that came easier, doors that opened faster, all of it built on a foundation of silence. He didn't excuse it, he named it for what it was: complicity. Saying that word out loud made his throat tighten, but he knew it was the only honest one. He said part of telling this story was accepting that he was not Jew, a witness, but also a participant. And that truth hurt more than any accusation ever could. He talked about how other Hollywood figures had whispered about Rob over the years, how rumors had drifted through hallways and dressing rooms like smoke. Some people laughed them off. Others chose not to listen. And some, like Michael, had known just enough to be afraid. He wondered how many careers have been quietly derailed, how many voices have been stifled, so that one man's reputation could remain spotless. As he described it, his voice cracked again, and tears spilled freely. He said he often thought about the people who never got to grow old, whose trauma stole their futures long before time ever could. That was the real tragedy of it all, not just what Rob Reiner did, but what the silence around him allowed to happen. Michael confessed that he had nearly walked away from this interview more than once. The fear of legal battles, of public backlash, of being seen as a villain instead of a survivor, all of it had nearly stopped him. But then he remembered that mother's letter, the shaking handwriting, the quiet desperation, and he knew he couldn't turn back again, that he said that somewhere deep down he still hoped Rob would come forward himself, that he would own what he had done and offer something resembling closure. But hope was not enough anymore. People deserved the truth, even if it was messy and painful and imperfect. The room was so quiet that Michael could hear his own breathing as he reached the end of this part of the story. He said that everything he had shared was leading to one final decision, a choice he had made that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone connected to Rob Reiner. His eyes locked onto the camera with a mixture of fear and resolve, as if he were about to step into a storm he could never escape. Michael said that final decision came quietly, without any dramatic music or flashing lights. Just a moment of stillness where he realized he could no longer live divided between who he was and what he knew. He had woken up one morning feeling weaker than usual, his body aching in ways that reminded him of how fragile life really is at 81. He sat at the edge of his bed, looking at the sunlight coming through the curtains, and thought about how many mornings he had wasted being afraid. That was the day he decided the truth, whatever it cost, was worth more than the safety of silence. He described making the call that would set everything in motion, a call to the journalist he had spoken to before, telling them he was ready to go on record. As soon as he hung up, his hands began to shake, not from fear alone, but from the strange release that comes when you finally stop running. He knew that once the story began to move, there would be no way to control it. No way to protect Rob or himself from what would follow. But for the first time in decades, he felt like he was breathing honestly. Michael said Rob must have sensed it because not long after another call came. Rob's voice sounded tired, resigned, as if he already knew what was happening. There was no anger this time, no threats, just a heavy silence between two men who had shared too much. Rob told him he wished things had been different, that he wished he had been a better person when it mattered. Michael said he didn't know how to respond to that. Wishing doesn't undo harm. Regret doesn't heal wounds. All he could do was listen. He talked about the days that followed, how the weight of anticipation was almost unbearable. Catherine stood by him, holding his hand when the fear crept back in. His children asked why he seemed so distant, so emotional, and he told them that sometimes telling the truth is the hardest thing a person can do. He wanted them to see him not as a hero, but as a flawed man, finally trying to do something right. Michael admitted that he still struggles with shame, that no amount of honesty can erase the years he stayed quiet. He thinks about the victims every day, about the people who were hurt while he kept his mouth shut. That is a burden he will carry for the rest of his life. But he also believes that silence would have been a worse legacy, one that would have haunted his children and their children long after he was gone. As he spoke, his voice grew softer, almost tender, when he mentioned Rob again. He said he doesn't know what will become of him now, whether the world will show him mercy or condemnation. All he knows is that Rob Reiner was once his friend, and that friendship became something twisted and painful over time. There's grief in that. Too, grief for the people they used to be before ambition and fear took over. Michael looked straight into the camera, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and a quiet strength. He said that telling this story was not about revenge or headlines. It was about finally letting light into a dark place that had been allowed to fester for too long. It was about giving voice to those who were silenced, even if his own voice trembled in the process. The studio seemed to fade around him as he finished, leaving only the sound of his breathing and the weight of everything he had revealed. He said he didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how the world would react, but for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not because the past was fixed, but because it was no longer hidden. And in that quiet, heavy moment, Michael Douglas sat there not as a movie star, not as a legend, but as a man who had finally chosen truth over fear, even though it had taken him a lifetime to get there. Michael sat back in his chair, the weight of everything he had said still hanging in the air like a final breath that refuses to fade. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the quiet hum of the studio and the distant sound of a world that was about to change. He said that after the camera stopped, he didn't feel relief the way he had imagined. What he felt was something deeper and more complicated, a kind of mourning for all the years he had lost to fear, for all the people who had been hurt while he stayed silent. And even for Rob Reiner, the man who had once been his friend before becoming the keeper of so many terrible secrets, he admitted that he doesn't expect forgiveness, not from the public and not from the victims. Forgiveness, he said, is something that has to be given freely, and he knows many may never be able to offer it. What he hopes for instead is honesty, a future where people don't have to whisper in hallways or hide their pain behind smiles. He wants his children to grow up in a world where powerful men are not protected by silence, where truth matters more than reputation. Michael spoke of Rob one last time, his voice heavy with complicated emotion. He said he still remembers the laughter they once shared, the dreams they had when they were young and thought they could conquer Hollywood together. But those memories now live beside darker ones, and he has learned that love and harm can exist in the same story. That is what makes it so hard to untangle, and so important to finally face that, as the lights dimmed. Michael looked older than ever, but also strangely lighter, as if a burden he had carried for decades had finally been set down. He said he doesn't know how history will judge him, or Rob, or anyone else caught in this web. All he knows is that silence nearly destroyed him, and that speaking, even now, even this late in life, was the only way he could begin to feel human again. The final words he offered were not loud or dramatic. They were soft, almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. He said that the truth does not always bring peace, but it brings something just as powerful, the chance to stop lying to yourself. And in that quiet truth, he hoped that maybe, just maybe, some healing could finally begin.